What if the town's most trusted family had been preparing the dead, because they were the ones killing them? In the quiet fall of 1823, the town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, barely a dot on the map, recorded 17 deaths in just 3 months. That's one death every 5 days, in a town of fewer than 300 souls. But what truly chilled the bones of those who looked back wasn't the number, it was the pattern. Every single body had passed through the same hands, the Hale family, owners of the town's only funeral parlour. They were respected, kind, and always there before the doctor. This isn't just a true story. It's a buried secret carved beneath the surface of America's forgotten history, where trust itself became the perfect weapon. What started as tragedy would unravel into one of the darkest horror stories in early American record. And the worst part, no one suspected a thing until a government physician came knocking and the truth began to seep through the floorboards. It began with a number 17. In the span of just 3 months, during the autumn of 1823, 17 people died in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small it didn't even appear on most maps. They weren't victims of war, nor disease, nor famine. These were men and women in seemingly good health who fell ill and passed within days, each one buried under the care of the same family, the Hales. To outsiders, it was tragic coincidence. But to those who dared to remember, it became one of the earliest and most disturbing true crime stories in American history. A case of trusted killers hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just suspicious death. This was systematic disappearance, masked by ritual, softened by kindness, and carried out with surgical precision. And while the town mourned, no one asked why the Hales were always there first. No one asked until Dr. Elias Whitmore arrived with state authority and a physician's eye. And what he found inside the Hale funeral parlour would not only change the town forever, it would begin to unravel one of the darkest chapters in America's buried history. 17 deaths, 1 funeral home, and not a single question asked until it was too late. In the remote hills of southeastern Pennsylvania, nestled between dense woods and dirt roads, lay the town of Millbrook, quiet, ordinary, forgettable. But in the fall of 1823, this town earned a place in America's most chilling forgotten cases. Over the course of just 90 days, 17 people died, all under mysterious yet strangely undisturbed circumstances. There were no riots, no public health alerts, no demands for answers, because every death had been gently ushered into the afterlife by the town's most trusted family, the Hales. They were known not for fear, but for comfort, for calm voices, clean hands, and impeccable burials. Every wooden coffin came with a warm pie and a whispered prayer. But beneath their pristine parlour floors, something far more calculated was unfolding. What if the tragedy wasn't a coincidence? What if the very hands preparing the dead were the ones ending their lives? This is the kind of true story that YouTube never forgets, because the people of Millbrook did. And that silence became the perfect cover for a pattern so dark. It would take an outsider, one skeptical doctor, to trace the line between grief and murder. In Millbrook, trust was everything, and that's exactly how they got away with it. The town of Millbrook wasn't the kind of place where questions lingered. Tucked away in the rolling countryside of Pennsylvania, it was a patchwork of weathered barns, one-room churches, and generations of families who believed that what was familiar was safe. There was no sheriff's office, no newspaper, no real reason to doubt your neighbour. People lived quiet lives and died quiet deaths. But in the fall of 1823, that silence became dangerous. Death moved like fog through the town, soft, unannounced, and oddly routine. And yet, no one panicked. Why would they? Each passing was followed by a proper ceremony, a well-crafted coffin, and the comforting presence of the Hale family. Gideon Hale, the patriarch, had been burying the town's dead for over 2 decades. His wife Abigail was known for her homemade soups and gentle prayers. Their children, polite and reserved, seemed to embody everything good about small-town America. But sometimes, the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they're the first ones to knock on your door with flowers, and by the time anyone saw through the kindness, it was already far too late. He came to inspect the dead, but the living made his blood run cold. Doctor? Elias Whitmore wasn't a man easily rattled. As a state-appointed physician, he had spent years travelling through the most forgotten corners of Pennsylvania, inspecting causes of death, checking for disease, and filing quiet reports no one ever read. Millbrook was supposed to be just another dot on his map, a sleepy, trusting town where nothing ever happened. But from the moment he stepped off his carriage and was greeted by the Hale family, something felt wrong. Too perfect. Too smooth. The way Gideon Hale extended his hand with practiced warmth, the way Abigail offered tea before a single question had been asked, and the way their daughter Evelyn stood at the top of the stairs, silent and still, just watching. The bodies he came to examine had already been dressed, sealed, and perfumed. Requests for access were met with courteous delays, polite excuses, and too much smiling. It was the kind of welcome that felt less like hospitality and more like choreography. And in a town where 17 had died in 3 months, Whitmore began to realise he wasn't there to inspect the dead. He was walking into a room full of secrets, still breathing. Before Millbrook became a mystery, the Hales were its pride. Long before whispers of poison and hidden chambers, the Hale family stood at the very heart of Millbrook's identity. For over 2 decades, they buried the town's dead, comforted the grieving, and fed the hungry. They were more than undertakers, they were caretakers of the living. Gideon Hale was the man you called when your father passed in the night. Abigail brought warm bread and soft words to widows before the tears even dried. Their sons were strong, silent, and respectful. And Evelyn had a face no one could forget, kind, distant, unreadable. In a town where survival meant community, the Hales became untouchable. And that's what made them so dangerous. Because when your hands have always handled the dead, who would ever question you if one more body appeared? This wasn't just a family business, it was a mask. And behind that mask lay something that would soon make Millbrook one of the most disturbing entries in dark American history. But to understand the darkness, we first have to understand how perfectly it was dressed in light. The scariest thing about the Hale family was how normal they were. In 1801, Gideon Hale arrived in Millbrook with his wife Abigail, 3 young children, and a wagon full of handcrafted coffins. He didn't claim to be a doctor. He didn't ask for money. He simply offered a service no one else had, preparing the dead with dignity. Before the Hales, death was messy. Families buried their own. Coffins were thrown together by the town carpenter, and grief was a private, disorganized thing. But the Hales brought structure, ceremony, cleanliness, comfort, and Millbrook, isolated and aging, welcomed that. What began as suspicion quickly turned into admiration. Gideon dressed like a preacher, spoke like a neighbour, and worked like a saint. Abigail, with her soft voice and quiet presence, became the town's unofficial healer, dispensing soup, salves, and scripture with the same gentle hands. Their sons, Silas and Thaddeus, helped with the heavy work, and little Evelyn, often seen placing flowers on strangers' graves, became the very symbol of innocence. To the outside eye, they were the embodiment of early American virtue. But looking back, something never quite added up. No one questioned how they afforded their stone house. No one asked why their coffins were always ready in advance. And no one, not even once, asked who taught Gideon the trade. Because when a town chooses comfort over curiosity, the truth doesn't just get buried, it gets embalmed. He came for a routine inspection, but what he found felt rehearsed, like everyone had memorized a lie. The first time Dr. Elias Whitmore walked through the doors of the Hale funeral parlour, he expected sawdust, sorrow, maybe the faint scent of embalming fluid. Instead, he was greeted by fresh lilac, polished wood, and a family standing too straight, too still, too ready. Gideon Hale shook his hand with calculated warmth. Abigail smiled like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. Evelyn stood in the corner, silent, eyes fixed like she was memorizing his every blink. Everything felt off. The parlour wasn't a place of mourning, it was staged like a showroom. Coffins gleamed like furniture. The bodies had been washed, dressed, even powdered, despite Whitmore's request to see them unprepared. Paperwork appeared before he asked. Death certificates were signed, but not by any attending physician. And when he asked about cause of death, Gideon always had an answer too fast, too detailed, as if he'd practiced. Millbrook had no doctor, no oversight, just the Hales. And in a town where grief was handled like clockwork, Whitmore began to wonder, was he investigating deaths, or auditioning for a part in someone else's performance? The bodies didn't lie, but the records did. Doctor. Whitmore's second day in Millbrook began before dawn. He'd asked, insisted, even that the next deceased not be touched until he arrived. But when he entered the parlour that morning, the body of a 38-year-old man named Peter Morrow was already scrubbed clean, dressed in Sunday clothes, lips stitched, eyes glued shut. Gideon apologised politely, claimed it was a miscommunication. But Whitmore saw something else, a pattern. Each corpse he examined bore faint signs no townsfolk had noticed: bruises around the neck hidden beneath collars, ligature marks disguised beneath sleeves, fingernails scrubbed too clean. And yet, every death was labelled natural causes. Abigail handed over logs written neatly, consistently, always in the same pen. They listed symptoms, times of death, family names, but lacked something vital: signatures. No physicians, no witnesses. Just the Hales. When Whitmore asked where the town kept official death registries, Gideon hesitated for the first time. "We've always managed things ourselves," he said. That's when Whitmore knew this wasn't just a family business. It was an entire ecosystem built on unquestioned trust. and paper-thin accountability. And the deeper he looked, the more he realised the real cause of death wasn't illness. It was control. He thought the bodies were the key, but the living held darker secrets. By the third day, Dr. Whitmore stopped looking at coffins and started watching faces. The townspeople spoke of the Hales with reverence, almost fear, as if questioning them would invite misfortune. No one complained. No one doubted. And yet, beneath the surface of every polite nod and whispered blessing, there was something else, a silence too perfect to be real. Whitmore realised this wasn't just about death. It was about power, who held it, who protected it, and who would rather look away than lose the only comfort they had. But it wasn't until he followed the daughter, Evelyn, past the cemetery gate, that he discovered the Hale family's most disturbing secret wasn't buried at all. It was still breathing. When everyone smiles the same way, you're either in on the secret or you're next. By the end of his third day in Millbrook, Dr. Whitmore felt the walls closing in. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Doors that were once open now stayed shut. The butcher no longer made eye contact. The postmaster misplaced his letters. The town, which once seemed warm and God-fearing, had gone cold and watchful. It wasn't just that people respected the Hale family. It was that they were afraid of them. He'd seen it in the eyes of Mary Lou, a widow who'd just lost her husband. Her hands trembled as she accepted a covered dish from Abigail. She tried to smile, but her voice cracked when she said thank you. And when Whitmore tried to ask her questions, her lips moved, but no sound came out. She simply looked at him with eyes that screamed, "One thing don't ask." That night, he found his hotel room door slightly ajar. Nothing stolen, nothing out of place. Just a hairpin left on his pillow, one he'd seen earlier that day, tucked behind Evelyn's ear. This was no longer about reports or suspicions. This was personal, and someone wanted him to know he wasn't welcome. The deeper he looked, the more the town looked back. Dr. Whitmore began documenting everything: scratches on door frames, repeated surnames on burial records, bruises hidden under lace collars. But every time he tried to mail a report, it vanished. Letters never reached Harrisburg. His notes disappeared from his satchel. One morning, he found his ink bottle poured out across the floor. At first, he thought it was sabotage. But then he realized it was a message: stop digging. And still, he dug. He noticed the same 6 men attending every funeral, standing in the same formation, silent, stiff, unmoved, no tears, no wives, no family, just men in black who seemed to be waiting for something or someone. One of them followed him to the edge of the forest, didn't say a word, just watched. Whitmore shouted. The man didn't flinch, just turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, he heard footsteps outside his window, then scratching, then singing, a girl's voice, soft, familiar. When he looked out, there was nothing but fog. Millbrook wasn't just hiding something, it was alive, coordinated, and now it was hunting him. The bodies didn't whisper, but Evelyn did. On the 5th night, unable to sleep, Dr. Whitmore followed a faint light flickering behind the funeral parlour. He stayed in the shadows, boots quiet on the damp grass, breath sharp in the cold. That's when he saw her Evelyn Hale, the daughter barefoot, walking between graves with a lantern in one hand and a scalpel in the other. She stopped at a fresh mound, knelt, and began humming. The same tune he'd heard outside his window. The same tune he'd heard in the chapel during Peter Morrow's funeral. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She cut precise, silent, surgical incisions into the earth, and then she looked up, right at him. Without fear, without surprise, just recognition. "You're not supposed to be here," she said softly. Not angry, not afraid. Like a child reminding someone of a bedtime rule. And then came the question that froze his blood. "Would you like to see what my father really does with the bodies?" That night, Whitmore realised he wasn't facing a crime. He was standing inside a ritual, and the girl in the graveyard, she wasn't a victim. She was an heir. She didn't threaten him, she invited him. After days of warnings disguised as politeness and fear cloaked in hospitality. "Doctor." Whitmore finally stood face to face with the truth, and it had Evelyn Hale's voice. Calm, curious, cold. What followed wasn't a chase, or a confession, it was an unravelling. A descent into something older than crime and deeper than evil. Because what the Hales were hiding wasn't just a secret, it was a system. One the entire town had helped bury. And as Evelyn led him toward the chapel basement, Whitmore realised the dead weren't the ones who kept Millbrook quiet. What he saw beneath the chapel shattered every law of nature he believed in. The basement was colder than the graveyard. Damp stone walls pulsed with rot, and the air buzzed not with electricity, but something else. Something wrong. Evelyn walked ahead, her lantern casting flickering shadows across the wooden beams. In the corner of the room, Whitmore saw them rows of preserved bodies, perfectly intact, dressed in their burial clothes, but their eyes were open, not glassy, not clouded, just open. And then he saw the ledgers, names, dates, weights, and payments. Some bodies had been there for years, never buried. Some were labelled reserved. One entry simply read reclaimed. These weren't funerals, they were deliveries. And the Hales, they weren't undertakers, they were curators. Preservers of something ancient, obsessive, and horrifying. Whitmore turned to Evelyn, trembling. She simply smiled and whispered, "You thought we buried them to honour the dead. We don't bury, we collect." In that moment, science, reason, and religion collapsed into one sickening truth. Millbrook never lost its dead. It kept them. The truth wasn't hidden. It was embalmed. In the farthest corner of the chapel basement, Dr. Whitmore found a locked cabinet made of iron and lined with symbols he didn't recognize, etched deep, as if meant to contain not just items, but something darker. Evelyn didn't stop him. She simply handed him a rusted key and stepped back, expression unreadable. Inside the cabinet were jars, dozens of them, each one sealed with wax, labelled in Gideon Hale's handwriting. They weren't chemicals. They were parts, human teeth, clumps of hair, preserved eyes floating in thick amber fluid. But what shattered Whitmore completely was the final jar, a fetus, no older than 8 weeks, labelled Unit Z. Viable. It wasn't death they were preserving, it was possession, generation after generation. The Hales weren't just burying the town, they were harvesting it, recording every bloodline, storing what they considered useful. And now, with his name scribbled in fresh ink on an empty jar nearby, Whitmore realised he was no longer a visitor. He was inventory. They didn't fear death because they'd never planned to leave. As Whitmore backed away from the jars, he noticed something even more disturbing. The basement had no stairs, no door leading out. Just the narrow passage they came through now sealed. Evelyn wasn't beside him anymore. He was alone, or so he thought. A whisper echoed through the stone, low and wet like breath across bone. He's ready. And then the lights dimmed, not flickered. Dimmed, like someone had slowly pulled life out of the room itself. Along the far wall, the bodies began to twitch, not violently, just enough to betray one horrific truth: they weren't dead. Preserved, paralysed, but aware, watching, waiting, held in suspension like artefacts in a museum of suffering. That's when he saw his own face reflected in a polished steel tray beside an open cot. Beside it, fresh linens, a silver tag already etched with his name and birth date. He wasn't there to expose the system. He was the next addition. In Millbrook, the line between caretaker and captive had never been real. It had only been timing. He thought he was writing a report, turns out. He was writing his own obituary, in a final desperate act. Whitmore reached into his coat for the small leather notebook he'd hidden there, the only copy of his findings not already tampered with. But it was gone. In its place was something colder, something wet. He pulled it out, a sealed envelope with a Hale family crest, his name handwritten on the front. Inside was a death certificate. His. Signed. Stamped. Dated for tomorrow. Every detail was correct: height, weight, eye colour, even cause of death. Accidental fall during inspection. He staggered backward, breath collapsing in his chest, trying to will himself awake from what no longer felt like horror, but design. Everything his arrival. The letters that never sent. The silence of the town, it had all been staged. He wasn't documenting a mystery. He was living inside it. A cog already filed, categorized, and prepared. The Hales didn't fear exposure because they'd engineered every possibility. They didn't bury threats. They embalmed them. And Whitmore was next in line, carefully preserved for a truth no one outside Millbrook would ever read. Millbrook didn't need to kill him, they just needed him to stay. As Whitmore stumbled through the flickering dark, the embalmed figures began to hum low, rhythmic, inhuman. It wasn't a song, it was a signal. From the shadows, Evelyn stepped forward, no longer the shy girl in lace. Her eyes were blank, her voice reciting names, dates, procedures, each word delivered like scripture. Subject 213, male, 42, no known kin, no further inquiry expected. It was him. She wasn't guessing she was reading. From a ledger that had been written before he arrived. This wasn't fate, it was administration. Whitmore wasn't the first. He was just the next. And all across the chapel basement, coffins began to stir. Latches creaked open. Eyes blinked in perfect unison. Limbs twitched like synchronized marionettes. The bodies weren't resting. They were rehearsing. Practiced. Preserved. Prepared. Millbrook wasn't a town with secrets. It was a vault. And he had just become another item sealed inside. In that moment, all logic, all belief, all science Whitmore had clung to cracked under the weight of a single, terrifying truth. They weren't saving the dead. They were storing the living. You don't escape Millbrook. You're absorbed by it. What comes next isn't a resolution. It's a reckoning. Because Whitmore didn't vanish. He transitioned into a silence so dense it felt alive, into a legacy that doesn't rot, but waits. And just when you think the horror is over, Millbrook delivers its final, chilling promise. Some records were never meant to be read aloud. Millbrook didn't bury him, they erased him. Weeks after Dr. Whitmore's disappearance, a new inspector arrived. Not because anyone called, because of a clerical rotation. When he asked about Whitmore, the townspeople smiled politely, confused. "We've never had a doctor. Whitmore here," they said in unison, like rehearsed lines. His car never registered. His room at the inn already reassigned. No files, no paper trail, no digital footprints. Even the letters he sent before arriving returned unopened, marked recipient unknown. It was as if the town had exhaled him out of existence. But behind the chapel, the earth had shifted subtle, but fresh. A new grave, unmarked but recently turned, and from the soft dirt above it, a single object poked through the corner of a leather notebook, waterlogged, pages warped. On its first page, scrawled in frantic ink, "They keep them awake." That night, the new inspector didn't sleep. Not from fear, but because every time he closed his eyes, he heard humming low, rhythmic, familiar. In Millbrook, disappearance isn't the end. It's the beginning of a silence that never truly lets go. He left no trace except the ones that scream in silence. 3 towns over, a janitor at a university library found an unmarked box wedged behind an old filing cabinet. Inside a reel-to-reel tape labelled only Millbrook Property Intake. Curious. He played it after hours. What he heard wasn't a lecture or a recording of voices. It was a single, unbroken hum, metallic, deep, like something vibrating just beneath the floor of the earth. Then, layered beneath the hum, barely audible, came names, one by one. Subject 212, Subject 213, Subject 200. Then, a pause. Subject 215, Elena Carr. He stopped the tape, shaking, sweating, but when he tried to rewind it, the reel had jammed, melted slightly, as if something inside had overheated. That night, he called in sick. The next morning, the library's basement was flooded, pipes burst with no apparent cause. The tape gone. Only a black smear where it had been. From that day forward, the janitor reported nightmares of being stacked. Filed, labelled, just another entry in a system that never ends, never sleeps, never forgives. In Millbrook, even whispers have weight. And once you hear the hum, it remembers you. Some places don't just haunt you, they archive you. Weeks after the Millbrook investigation was quietly shut down, a medical examiner in Chicago received an anonymous delivery, a sealed manila folder labelled Transferred Documentation, Hale Collection. Inside were post-mortem reports, highly detailed, but the oddity wasn't in the data. It was the dates. The listed subjects had reportedly died decades apart, yet every autopsy was signed on the same day. Same pen, same pressure, same ink. More chilling. Several of the listed names matched missing persons reports from the last 6 months. The examiner contacted state authorities, but the file vanished from his desk overnight, along with his access badge. His replacement claimed he'd never worked there. His name was scrubbed from the system within 48 hours. Days later, his neighbour reported hearing soft humming from his apartment. When officers finally broke down the door, the room was empty, no furniture, no signs of struggle, just a single tag taped to the wall. Subject 216. In Millbrook's world, you don't die. You're categorized, indexed, filed in silence. And once that number's assigned, you belong to the system forever. The Hale legacy isn't buried, it's replicated. In a remote storage facility in Vermont, a technician reviewing overdue inventory flagged a strange crate labelled Anthropological Archives. Millbrook. It hadn't been checked out, scanned, or moved in over 30 years. But its biometric log showed recent access by an ID number no longer in the system. When he opened the crate, he found dozens of wax-sealed jars, each containing faded scraps of what appeared to be human vocal cords, suspended in amber-hued liquid. Each jar bore a label, voice sample, subject 190 through 215, and beneath them, tucked in velvet-lined drawers, were aged index cards listing sound wave frequencies, behavioural responses, and most disturbingly trigger phrases. One phrase repeated every few lines. They respond to the hum. The technician, horrified, called his supervisor, but by the time they returned, the crate was gone. The room's cameras, dead for exactly 6 minutes. The only thing left was a single strip of magnetic tape looped around the desk lamp, playing a distorted whisper. Catalogue complete. The Hales didn't just collect voices, they preserved obedience. And if they could preserve that, what else might still be active? You can shut down a lab, but you can't quarantine a frequency. A month after Millbrook's final structure was demolished, residents in the surrounding counties began reporting a strange phenomenon. Their radios, regardless of station, would cut out briefly at 2:15 AR sharp. For exactly 12 seconds, a low, mechanical hum would play, followed by a single whispered word, next. The FCC launched an investigation, but nothing traced no tower interference, no rogue transmissions. Just silence. That was until a ham radio operator in Ohio recorded the anomaly and slowed it down. Beneath the hum, layered in ghosted frequencies, were coordinates pointing to the original Millbrook site. But the land had been scorched, paved, sealed by the government. Still, the signal persisted. Days later, the radio operator was found unresponsive. Hands clutched over his ears, nails dug into his palms. The only note left behind read, "It knows I listened." Because some echoes don't fade, some archives don't close, and some experiments are still running. You didn't survive Millbrook. You just haven't been filed yet. In the end, some stories don't ask to be understood. They demand to be remembered. The tale of Millbrook isn't just about science gone wrong or voices trapped in glass. It's a mirror held up to our darkest fears, the fear of being lost, of being labelled, of becoming data in someone else's file. And maybe the most chilling part, the experiment may never have ended. If you've ever heard that hum in the middle of the night, maybe you were never meant to forget. Maybe you're next in the archive. Now it's your turn. What would you do if your name appeared on that list? Comment below. We read every story. Save this video if it left a mark. and subscribe if you're ready to keep digging through the hidden, the buried, and the things we're told to forget. Because the past is never really gone, it's just waiting to be reactivated.